welcome to the SquaMates podcast. This is a very serious podcast about reptiles and amphibians, and I'm one of your hosts. My name is Dr. Mark D. Schertz. I am the curator of herpetology at the Natural History Museum, Denmark, and I'm joined today by my three lovely co-hosts. As always, we'll start with Gabriel.
I'm Gabriel Ugueto, and I'm a paleo artist, scientific illustrator, and concept artist, and I used to work in herpetology, but not anymore.
And Ethan.
I am the curator of reptiles and amphibians at my house, and I'm an artist and illustrator, and what have you.
And Hural.
Hi everyone, I'm a snake ecologist and conservationist from South Africa.
Fantastic. We are going to change things up a little bit today. We're doing things a little differently. Who cares about what's going on in our lives or in the world? Let's bury our heads in the questions and interests of our very dear listeners. So we have two main questions that we're going to talk about today. The first is a question that we got on Blue Sky by Derek Den Oden, which is lots of neotenic salamanders, but no neotenic frogs. What's the deal with that? And I think we've talked about this. We touched on this a little bit in the past, but it's a really interesting thing, right? So neoteny, for those who are not familiar with the term, just means that you're an adult with reproductive activity. So you're mature in terms of your gonads, but you are retaining your larval morphology. So not undergoing a complete metamorphosis, as it were. Quite widespread in salamanders, especially in ambistomatid salamanders, where we see it in many different species, right?
Yeah,
but
most famously, the axolotl.
Yes, axolotl is the number one thing that people will be familiar with. It's actually just one of several ambystoma that are neotenic. But many people will be familiar with others. So mud puppies, for instance, another classic example.
Sirens.
Sirens. Well,
a lot of those cave salamanders too.
Cave salamanders, that's quite common. There are, in fact, also neotenic newts. So the salamandrid or triturid newts. In Europe, there are populations of neotenic neotenic newts, which is really cool.
I've had Ichthyosaura, alpine newts do it.
Yes, exactly. There are specific populations of alpine newts that do this. Actually, there's a really cool project going on right now. I think it's Anne-Claire Fabre who's running this project to understand kind of local populations and how that is kind of done, how it's achieved, and why they're doing that. And to go a little bit into that topic, right? The reason we think that newts do this, or that there is this facultative, in many cases, facultative ability to have specific populations have neoteny and other ones not, or to have a typically neotenous population that, given specific chemicals, so for instance, you put iodine in the tank of an axolotl, you will cause it to metamorphose into a terrestrial salamander. And we think that that's kind of an adaptability thing, so that it gives them the phenotypic flexibility to deal with conditions that are poor, because when they have to, they can come out of the water and they can move across land to go to other places.
It's a thyroid thing too, right?
Thyroid
and
gland, yes.
It's an experiment that's been around for like 200 years now.
I think what happens with the iodine is it causes the thyroid hormone to spike.
Thyroxine to spike,
and then that causes this cascade effect. Basically, triggers metamorphosis, even in a salamander or a newt that wouldn't typically undergo metamorphosis. Right, so it's very adaptive in those animals. Typically, so neoteny happens across many different groups of animals. It's not just in salamanders, although salamanders are kind of our textbook example of it.
There are folks who argue that human beings may be neotenic.
In some ways, and that's something. So there was a lot of very important work on this topic was done by Stephen Jay Gould. He did some really important synthetic book writing actually on this topic that kind of brought together 150 years of discussions around these things. And what it boils down to is essentially changes in the timing of development of things. You have a normal maturation rate in terms of overall body size, but an acceleration of the maturation of gonads and failure to undergo that major metamorphosis event that will lead you to a neoteny that looks something like our axolotl, right? So those kinds of, it's really just a changing in the timing of events. You can delay things, you can move things earlier, and all of those things. This is called heterochrony, a very, very important topic in developmental biology. So why would that be the case in salamanders, but why was it never happen in frogs? I think this is fascinating. You guys heard about, what was it called? The giant bullfrog tadpole?
Oh, yeah. Goliath.
Goliath, yeah. Shared on Twitter. Forgive me, I can't remember who posted it originally on Twitter.
It might have been Aaron McGee, maybe?
I thought it might have been Aaron McGee. Yeah, so shout out to her, and may Twitter rest in peace. But she is now on Blue Sky, so you can go follow her there. And I think so this was an example of a gigantic tadpole of a frog. And we've had similar examples. Actually, we have some in the collection here of for instance, spadefoot frogs or spadefoot toads that can also have these giant tadpoles. And what seems to be the problem with them is some kind of thyroid disorder. So they are, I was given to understand that there's something to do with the delay in, if they hatch at the wrong season, they get to a certain size, they might overwinter and then continue to grow. That's one thing. But then we have these truly like Goliath tadpoles. And I think that's probably a thyroid disorder, which, there are also thyroid disorders in humans that can cause a variety of different effects in the development and physiology of humans, because the thyroid gland is obviously critical for metabolism and things like that. So in any case, we get tadpoles, we get frogs that live exclusively as tadpoles for a very, very long time. But it does not happen that we get neotenic frogs. In fact, there are no frogs that even retain the tail as an adult, like that are reproductive with the tail still present.
There's no non-metamorphosing frogs.
Exactly. And metamorphosis always goes to completion. So you do not have frogs. So the classic example, they're shouting at their ready. What about Ascaphus? What about tailed frogs? Tailed frogs don't have a tail. The structure at the back of the body that looks like a tail is an intermittent secondary organ for, well, I believe they have intermittence. So they are basically internally fertilizing frogs. Yes, they have dick butt.
It's a dick butt frog.
Yeah, but it is not homologous with the end of the tail. So it is a secondary structure. This is not the tail being retained into adulthood. You can look up, there are quite a few frogs that have very weird metamorphic stages where they have the long tail and fully developed frog, and they stay like that for a long time, but they never keep it into reproductive adulthood.
Was it Paradoxus, I think, is the one is called that because the tadpole is so huge?
Pseudis paradoxus.
Yeah. And
it's a whole genus.
So Pseudis as a genus, they have tadpoles that are larger than the frogs are, but they don't actually, they have a normal metamorphosis per se. I believe there is an Indian frog, I can't remember the name of it at the moment, where the tail is stays present for a really, really long time, but they nevertheless eventually complete metamorphosis and then become reproductively active. So why would that be? Why would we not have retention of this? In fact, why not move it even before even the legs kind of get activated? You could still, in theory, maybe retain the larval mouth parts, which are fundamentally different than adult mouth parts in frogs, and some other aspects of the body, but mature the gonads, right? That should, in principle, it's hard to imagine why that wouldn't be the case. My understanding is that the reason we don't see this is that there are developmental sequences required for the initiation of gonad maturation that cannot be dispensed with, have not been dispensed with so far in frogs. So, and those are tied to limb development and loss of the tail. So basically, you can't get there because all these other series of events have to happen first. And it's also related to the position of the vent on frogs is sometimes in the midline in some species, but also sometimes it's off the midline in tadpoles, sorry. And then all kinds of different things about the internal anatomy of those tadpoles is quite different. Additionally, a really fundamentally important aspect to mating biology of most, but not all frogs, is amplexus, right? So they have to, there's a whole bunch of grabby stuff involved in frog reproduction in the vast majority of frogs. Some of them have found alternative solutions. They're the ones that only bump uglies, as it were. And there are other alternative solutions. There are things like tail frogs with internal fertilization and those kinds of things. But getting there is a big evolutionary jump from a tadpole. And in the case of frogs, I think we're starting way too far along.
I would also imagine that the frog body plan in general is very, very, very derived. Whereas what you see in salamanders is very plesiomorphic. It's this.
Yeah.
Yes. I think, So it's a good question about when in those stem amphibians or stemless amphibians, did we lose the ability? So basically, where along the branch in the early amphibia did we lose the ability to do this?
Yeah.
Because I can't remember now if there are caecilians that are also.
I was just going to ask that. I don't think there are.
If there are caecilians that what?
Are neotenic.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I've been trying to think.
Either.
No,
there are caecilians that have very well developed gills when they're young, but they are. I believe they all lose those gills when they mature,
including the fully aquatic species.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, Typhonectes would be the first one to come up there, and it's not. So somewhere along the line, we basically lost the ability in early anurans to do this, perhaps. And I agree with you, Gabriel, that with the assessment that they are extremely derived. I think this is something that's been established in the literature for an extremely long time. Anurans have the fewest vertebrae of any vertebrate. They have just two cervical basically just two cervical vertebrae, if you even call them cervical vertebrae, and then just 8 presacral vertebrae in the vast majority of species. So in total, you have 9 vertebrae in the vast majority of frogs, which is basically nothing.
To me, it's sort of, the question isn't really why don't frogs have neoteny. It's more why do salamanders at all?
I think we can go a step back up the tree and go look at fish. There are plenty of fishes that are neotenic.
Yeah, and also there are fossil records of temnospondyls and stuff like that are neotenic. So
good. Okay, cool. Yeah.
So there is. It
was retained fairly early on. It is, of course, then on the other side of our tree, within the amniotes, not at all present. And I think this is something that's really special. So among the tetrapods, it's essentially only the salamanders have retained the ability to do this, but the fishes would have had it as well. There is something special about salamanders in this relationship, and conversely, some major change in the frogs. My guess would be that these lineages have lost the ability to do so independently. That the amphibians and the amniotes have lost the ability to be neotenic independently, because they're basically different processes that I can see being involved there. With the amniotes, you had to develop basically you needed to be waterproof. And none of those larvae, none of our embryos are in any way waterproof. So you'd have to move waterproofing your skin way earlier into development, not really compatible with anything that the amniotes were doing. On the other hand, with the amphibians, the waterproofing isn't the big deal because they just don't do that. keep moist skin. So I'm that's my guess. It's I qualify it with just this is my hypothesis, but.
What Ethan was saying, I mean, there are some species that can retain some neotenic characteristics, but that doesn't. I don't think that qualifies as complete. It doesn't qualify as complete neoteny.
Exactly.
In all of these cases, it's always developmental constraints. That's what we're really talking about.
Yeah, there's a lot of developmental and evolutionary constraints. It's not just developmental constraints, like what we can do, but also like what can evolution achieve. And certain processes are easier for evolution to achieve because the number of steps involved, which here steps is a euphemism for many different modifications of, developmental processes, expression patterns, transcription factors, etc.
It's not impossible that you would get a selection pressure like that,
but the likelihood is low, very, very low. Yeah. So I think that's basically it. I think that we just have too many constraints on the Anuran Bauplan, too much happening in the hip there that's specific to adult frogs. If you've ever dissected a frog, you would know, or you would have seen that the gonads are directly connected to the kidneys, and the kidneys are directly connected, basically directly underneath the vertebral column. Tadpoles don't have a vertebral column yet. They basically just have a notochord. So when you don't have those anchoring structures, very hard to imagine how you're going to achieve that. And you have that segmented tail of the tadpole. That all has to be done away with, absorbed, and converted into notochord tissue.
Also, aren't tadpoles also very derived compared to the larvae of salamanders? They also have a whole bunch of structures that not.
They are highly derived. I think a lot of our picture of that. I confess I'm not deeply in touch with the literature on a lot of this stuff, but I would say that many of the things that we do know about tadpoles in general is highly biased because the deep lineages that we use at the base of the Anuran tree are also themselves highly derived. So, for instance, the pipids have pretty derived tadpoles, filter feeding tadpoles.
Sometimes no tadpoles at all.
Exactly. They skip them. And then we know, for instance, from the developmental literature, that some of the frogs that have evolved direct development have again changed this whole sequence of so in amphibians, in frogs, the general sequence is the hind limbs develop, the forelimbs develop inside the body and then pop out of the body, right? They develop inside the body cavity and they pop through the wall. One of them usually goes through the spiracle, which is usually on the left-hand side, and the other one just literally punches through the wall of the body. It's so badass.
I've asked about this before because it used to confuse me a lot, right?
But one day to the next, they have arms, right?
And the arms are developing
inside
actually
you can see them through the body,
right?
Because it really can first.
Yes, because I asked about this. Because in Caudata, in salamanders, the forelimbs always develop first, and then the hind limbs way after. Mm-hmm. And I was like, why is it the reverse?
We just don't see them as
exactly
the limb. Yeah, right. Which makes a lot of sense now that you say that, because Eleutherodactylus, which longtime listeners of the pod will remember, the Eleutherodactylus who used to sing so beautifully in the background of my audio, they're direct developing frogs. And when they started to look at the developmental series of Eleutherodactylus, the forelimbs and the hind limbs, I think they develop more or less synchronously, if not the forelimbs slightly ahead of them. And there's no punching through body walls. It's much more like salamander order of development in terms of the limb development. So the point here being to say that it's super heterogeneous within frogs, but yes,
that's everything else.
It is still very derived. There was this recent fossil of a tadpole that was was that Brazil that it was found in? I don't remember now.
I can't remember.
But it's the largest tadpole ever found. Very, very, very well preserved with soft tissue and everything. and it essentially looked like every other tadpole we've ever seen, just bigger. So it's very possible that some of the earlier batrachians were also having tadpole-like things, or some of the even Stemanurans, I guess, would have been having tadpole-like things. Sorry, Gabriel. I'm so bad at these early terminology things about fossils. I don't know where to use.
No, it's fine.
They all had larvae, whether they were,
Yeah. But these things.
What is surprising to me is that in frogs, larvae and adults live completely different lives. To the point, like of everything, feeding, behavior, everything. I don't think it's as noticeable in salamanders in that way.
It's certainly not in those that are neotenic.
I mean, I think we've talked about the idea of niche partitioning before and what that means for them, and that's like you have efts that occupy a different ecological niche than the adults do.
Yeah, but it's not like saying like they change everything about them, like feeding behavior, like everything.
The most important difference is that most frog larvae are herbivores, and all frogs are carnivores as adults.
It makes them way fucking easier to raise, I'll tell you that much.
And they have to change all their mouth parts, and it's just crazy the amount of changes that they go through.
Well, so if you raise salamanders, the larvae are a pain in the ass because they only eat live food when they hatch.
They're carnivores. All of them are carnivores. So that it is definitely true that in terms of the trophic position, the frogs go from primary consumers to being mesopredators during their transition, whereas salamanders and newts go from being aquatic mesopredators to terrestrial mesopredators. And that's not nearly as big of a shift. This is why frogs are the most important organisms in the world, right? Because they do it all. They occupy both of those spaces.
I should have just gotten with frogs because you just crush a little fish food up for them and they're happy as can be. And
they sing away that they're in love. It's great. Yeah. It's great. Okay, so I hope that we've answered your question, Derek. The answer to your what's the deal with that is restriction, constraint. They do what they can, but there seems to be some kind of limits on what is or is not possible. Great. Let's move on to the second question that we have today. And we only have 2 questions today because I presume that then this next question is going to occupy all of the rest of the episode. Because this is a question we received over on YouTube from Tamara Riffo, who asked, is there any book you would recommend as basic info on reptiles? I love that I want to start learning more about them, but I don't know where to start. You are in luck, friend. Here are some nerds who can give you a good place to start.
Asked 4 herp nerds what their favorite books are.
So, what I thought we would do, let's try and go through from fundamental literature to specific literature to field guides, and then we can also talk about a more hobby-oriented literature. So let me start you off by saying textbooks, right? Which are the textbooks that people often know about? I don't have all of them here. I only have a few. For those of you watching over on youtube.com/@SquaMatesPod, you'll be able to see them on the video. I have a couple. None of them are the latest edition because we don't have the budget for that. But basically, we have the POW herpetology, POW et al. Herpetology textbook, and we have the Zug et al. Herpetology textbook. The thing about herpetology textbooks is that I have never read one. In fact, I've almost never read any of one. Which is to say, you can become a curator at a national museum in this field without ever having used one. That is not to say that they're not useful. It just means that you can get the same information through other sources. They can be useful reference works, especially if you're interested in trying to educate yourself on this topic in your own time, because they do contain a very good basic level introduction to more or less everything you need to know. As I say, what the books I have in front of me are very old indeed. This is the 2nd edition of the POW et al. Book, which
they're like on the 5th edition now, something like that.
Be on the 5th or so. This is from 2001. I imagine all the other, most of these things have much more recent editions, especially because they're so expensive that it makes a lot of money for them.
This might be the point to mention, because we said this sort of offline prior, that a lot of our books are out of date, and that's okay.
They're fine.
There's no way of making a book that is up to date all the time.
You learn to live with this.
Yes. Yeah. And remember also, very important to know, Wikipedia is at least 14 years out of date for most topics. It's not just books. It's also Wikipedia. So if you're getting your sources from anywhere and you're trying to rely on, for instance, Wikipedia to get basic information, bear in mind that it's probably very out of date.
I must say that if you're getting your topics on paleontology, Wikipedia paleontology is surprisingly up to date. So it's really up to date to the point that if a species is described one day, the next day has a Wikipedia page already.
Especially for dinosaurs. Less so for a random wasp in amber.
But for tetrapods, it's not bad.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say there are a lot of people updating those pages, and they're doing a good job.
Nerds,
yeah, right. So I think these herpetology textbooks will give you a good overview of like general systematics, very useful for listening to our show, especially if you have started on this episode of the show and you want to have a good context for understanding episode 1 of the show.
God help you.
It might be useful to have a book in front of you that has an overview of those. So I think that, they have their utility. I don't think that they should be the first book that you buy on reptiles and amphibians. Because I do think that they will take all of the joy out of it. They've got pretty pictures, but ultimately that's not what you're here for. Just to mention a couple other things, if you're kind of interested in methods in the field, there's this book by Roy McDermott et al. Called Reptile Biodiversity, Standard Methods for Inventory and Monitoring. Really, really cool book. And it has a lot of details that you will have a hard time getting in other formats. So for instance, how to preserve specimens, things to consider with labeling the specimens, data that you could collect, different ways that you can survey things that are difficult to survey, like snakes, for instance, where detection rate is really low, or your risk of missing an animal is really low. So this is a good general resource to have if you're interested in that. I didn't know where to put it in the list here, so I thought I'd put it in here. Let me talk now about the most important textbook if you are interested in amphibians. My exception to the rule of don't buy a textbook for your for herpetology is this book by Dulman and Troop. It is called Biology of Amphibians. It's actually based on an earlier book by I can't remember who.
And this is in English, right?
This is in English.
Yeah. And Dulman and Troop are like
legends,
superstars. They are legends on amphibian research.
I'm only bringing that up because they didn't specify, and there are a huge number of books in other languages that are like, as far as salamander books, there's a ton of them in German that are way better than what you can get in English.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the reason I talk about this book specifically is that this is the reference book for most amphibian anatomy and a lot of amphibian ecology. So if you're interested in understanding the muscles that control the larynx, this is where you find out the name of those muscles. There are 2 major editions, and it literally does not make a difference which one you have. One of them has some figures misprinted, and otherwise they are practically identical. So you don't have to worry too much about them. They're not super easy to get nowadays, but they're incredibly, incredibly useful resources. Both of them, this book ends with a systematic treatment and talk about the evolution that gives you an overview of the diversity of the various different groups of amphibians. Bear in mind, the book is from 1994, but is, I think, actually based on taxonomy from even earlier, 1986. So very outdated taxonomy, which is problematic if you're trying to understand things in the context of
Isn't there a newer edition of that one?
No.
Because I have... Yeah.
Unfortunately not. there needs to be. It would need to be a very, very large volume, if not multiple volumes. But
I'm going to say that people don't really need to focus on that, because right now we have all kind of access to online, like amphibian species of the world,
exactly.
Amphibia web, which keeps the taxonomy up to date, and you can check those for taxonomic reasons, and then keep the book for stuff like anatomy and stuff like that.
I feel like the books nowadays should just be printed with like a QR code for the taxonomy.
We literally are doing that now, or talking about doing that for field guides now.
So can I give a little bit an insert here? I was working for a long time when I was working back in herpetology. I was working for a long time on a field guide of the reptiles and amphibians of Venezuela. And my idea was originally to create both a book, but also a website and an online thing that will keep things up to date taxonomically.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the path to go. That's the way to focus this thing. Because
for amphibians especially, it's so important that you can hear the call. And you can't integrate that into a book. It's so difficult. I mean, you can go children's book style. They have like little
once again, ornithology has it all beaten, because they have stuff like eBird where things are all the time. They have all the calls. So
you bring up a good point with field guides too. People use field guides in all sorts of different ways, right? So it's like, if you're more of a birder type and it's like, what did I hear? A field guide isn't going to help you. Whereas
it does if it is a birder, because you have the calls.
Right. But I mean,
that's what I would think it would work great. Field guides, to me, they don't have to be printed anymore unless you want like a special.
No, okay. So we're in agreement. That's what I mean. Is right. Like, if let's say you're bitten by something, right? I don't care if the taxonomy is wrong. Like, I just need to know what it was.
Exactly.
So it's your goal in terms of what it is you're seeking in the field guide kind of informs how you use it.
Definitely.
And for me, a lot of the times I use iNaturalist probably more than I do a printed field guide. Yep. I have this with me because I was going to mention that, like, I know most of the herps around me. Like, if I'm in the Northeast US, I don't really use a field guide unless I just want to look at iNaturalist to say, okay, these are the observations around
near
me. But like when I go out west, I'm not as familiar with things, so I have this. This is the Peterson Guide to the Western U.S., and that's my personal copy of that, and it's great because I can go and I can look at the.
But to be fair, every time I go to a new place, the first thing I do is to go to eBird and to go to iNaturalist, and I go, okay, I'm going to be staying here. What is around me? Because
you can literally just get the species list.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I agree with you. They're very big. There's great utility to that. Let's come back to the field guides, because I think there are a couple example field guides that I'd like to flag as being like really cool.
Okay.
But that we don't have to. I think we jumped the gun a little bit by going into the field guides straight away, because
sorry, that was me. But
it's fine. I think that the field guides are a really important aspect, but they have a specific utility. And let's just go into field guides.
Well, that's kind of what I was saying. That's kind of what I was getting at, right? So, is that like the why you want the field guide kind of informs what field guide you're going to get.
Definitely. And I think that there are different classes of field guide. I literally call this book, which is Frank Glav and Miguel Vences' Amphibians and Field Guide to the Amphibians and Reptiles of Madagascar. I literally call this the Bible. It lives often either at my desk or beside my bed. And it's very well loved and full of handwritten notes and whatever.
Yeah.
In terms of overall field guide quality, in terms of like a ranking of the top 10 field guides I've ever had, it's not on there. Yeah. It's not even because it's the third edition. It's actually worse than the second edition in many aspects. The second edition had these beautiful comparative tables. You could look at specific morphology and be like, oh, if it's this genus, it would have this and not that and that. And then I can just do, instead of a key, I've just got a comparative table. Amazing. It also had keys in it. This book is basically just, here's a picture and a species account and a map. Yeah. So in terms
it was
of
called a photographic field
it's
guide.
a photographic field guide, and as a photographic field guide, it has a few problems. One of the problems is that the binding just comes completely off. When you first get it, the binding just comes right off. So, but very, very fundamentally important. At the other end of the spectrum, I don't know how you guys feel about these books, but Tuan Leyendas has the Amphibians of Costa Rica and another guide called the Reptiles of Costa Rica. And these are phenomenally beautiful field guides with a huge amount of design that has gone into them. So to present to the video audience, it's just an example here. You can see like they've cut out the amphibians. They've got labels pointing to specific useful characters to look at, and an array of similar looking species and how they're distinguished along the bottom. Incredibly useful level of detail.
I just realized I have a lot to say about this subject.
About field guides, or about this field guide in particular?
No, about field guides, because I have quite a bit of a bunch of experiences that I would like to share. First of all, as a person who was trying to do a field guide, and what I considered you should do and what you shouldn't do, the advantages of having illustrations instead of photographs. There are a bunch of things. If you want, I can go into it right now.
I was just going to bring that up. Like for me, I much prefer, believe it or not, I much prefer a plate of illustrations because it's an idealized version of the animal that I need. A photo doesn't actually tell you as much.
Yes. And that is exactly the reason why I agree with that. I think an illustration can show you the animal in the exact same position, so you can compare certain detailed characters that you cannot do in a regular with photographs. Also, photographs, depending on the lens you're using and all that, can really change the shape of an animal to make it unrecognizable. And I think sometimes you see some of those guides now. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about them again. Like the reptiles of Ecuador is terrible. I don't like the way that you position. I mean, the information is great, and they have done a magnificent research job, and it's really a colossal amount of work that they've done.
It's a huge book.
It's a huge book, and it has a lot of information. They have done a lot. But I really dislike the way they positioned, and sometimes I think Photoshop animals to make them appear in certain positions that they don't naturally take, and they end up looking. To me, they have the same effect that you would see in those like 18th century plates where the animals are all in crazy shapes. They don't take. It's really unpleasant.
My question there, Gabriel, is how is that really different than an illustration in an idealized pose?
Because you can choose. What I was trying to do with my field guide is that I will choose. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Gymnostalmus species. What is the position that you normally see a Gymnostalmus species? Usually all of what I would do is that I would change the position depending of the genus, because usually the same genus tend to adapt the same kind of behaviors. So I would put all the Gymnostalmus in a certain position and then compare, they have these lines here, they have these stripes here, and then you can compare and easily check that like that. And you will see an animal that you will recognize by the shape and the overall, shape, which that is something they do really well on bird field guides.
And
it has a very big diagnostic value to it, because you can recognize an animal by the shape alone.
I think that's also one of the remarkable things that you did several years ago, these very quick sketch plates of what was that, Coryphaetidae or
Corytophanidae?
Corytophanidae. I was close. And they're like, even though you haven't drawn all the scales, you haven't gone into super detail, the key characteristics that are present in those animals are visible, even though they're very stylized. Like I also appreciate there's a great deal of value to that. I do think that there are also very different schools here. Ethan, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that's actually the main reason I go with the Petersons over like the Audubon. It is the Audubons tend to be all photos and very few illustrations. This tends to be mostly illustrations, for exactly that reason. It's also the reason I have a field guide at all over just using iNaturalist.
Right. Right. Exactly. I mean, today, especially in a place as heavily visited as the American Midwest, you've like the density of photographs is just immense. Whereas the opportunity, I think conversely, we have this other problem in cases like Madagascar, for instance. So if I pull up a picture of Micropistodon, which is shown in this book based on a terrible photo.
Yeah.
That's the only photo there was. Doing a good illustration of that species at all would have been very, very, very hard. So it's a question of using a bad photo or an inaccurate illustration, and the photo is more honest, let's say.
But wait a minute, it depends, because there are museum material
from the specimen. It would be a different story, of course.
But there are museum material from the species, right?
Yeah, there was one specimen.
Okay, I can do a very good illustration from a museum material.
I believe that. But
it's amazing what if you hire a good illustrator that knows how to depict reptiles, they will do a good illustration based on museum material.
So as an illustrator who doesn't typically do that, who spent time doing it this October with skinks, just for fun, I can say it's hard. What you do is it's actually really difficult to do well, to illustrate, to get the scalation accurate, to get and still not have that be the actual focus of the piece. It to just show it as it is or as it should be. That's actually really difficult to do, and do well. So I have a lot of
everything, it's experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Everything, it's how much you have to do. Can I just say something really quick about our field guides? Just to if we're gonna change the subject, is that I'm gonna say that one of the other problems that field guides for reptiles and amphibians have is that there's very little resources for them, and their publishers are really against publishing them because they don't think that there is enough market.
Which is hilarious because they sell really well.
Well, one of the big examples of that was when I created all those plates of the Corretophanes, and then I did some of the Philomedusine frogs.
Beautiful.
I made a case that I would really like people from the Lynx editions to do something like that with reptiles, because they've done so many amazing books with mammals and mammals of the world and birds of the world. And they eventually contacted me, and we were in discussions to do one of reptiles and amphibians of the world, like one series of books for reptiles and one series of books for amphibians. And they were like, well, let me talk to you and see, and if you can recommend me some herpetologists to do the text. And I recommended many people, including Mark, to do the, but then eventually it fizzled out and they didn't contact me anymore.
Happening.
It is happening, but without me.
Apparently. They have announced that. I think it was even at the World Congress, they had a thing that the Lynx editions for, I don't remember if it was amphibians or reptiles, is coming.
Really? It's coming without me.
Yeah.
I know that they wanted to talk to me, but
yeah. Well,
but the whole idea why they were going back and forth with me is that they say, well, we don't know if there is interest, we don't know if there is if there's money in it, so we don't know if we're going to be able to do it, blah blah blah. So
yeah, I mean, they are. I think the thing to acknowledge of all of these books is that none of them are cheap. Field guides, especially the latest field guides, especially those by the publishing house Chimaira, are insanely expensive. Many of them are many times the price of an equivalent book printed on in a different subject. on the same quality of paper. And I don't understand this. For some reason, they've just decided that because it doesn't sell a lot, they are going to price it way up. But
I just looked at the price on the back of my Peterson's, and it says $24.99 US. And then to the right of it, it doesn't list a price. It just says higher in Canada.
Oh, that's so funny. Well,
I'm going to guess that now that may not be true.
True. But I would also just say, like, for instance, the reptiles of Ecuador, I actually really want to go look this up because
they're crowdfunded.
The book is crowdfunded.
Oh, God.
But the new price of the book from NHBS in the UK is €124.
Which is not terrible for that kind of book.
It's insane for that kind of book. It should cost
well, no, but I mean, look at the
euros.
prices of other books like that. From the Lynx edition, I have paid a ton of money for the ones of
but
Birds
the
of
Lynx
the
editions are big format,
super
high quality books. This book is printed essentially like Chimera, and which actually brings us on to the next topic. Chimera books, like this one, which is Colin Tilbury's second edition of The Chameleons of Africa, some of them are big format, similar to Lynx edition, way worse print quality, way worse in overall thing, but probably around the same price. It's just insane.
This is, again, a thing where I feel like having done some publishing now, where e versions of these books should be a thing.
Yeah.
Which
in some cases they are.
It would make so much more sense, especially because you could be
but you will be surprised in how many cases they are not.
And they're very resistant to that. Yeah. I was going to ask, it would make sense, especially in like Harald, in like South Africa, where like you have it could be a life or death thing, right? People being able to know what species are around them, where like it's like here's a free ebook of like the snakes in your area.
But I think you overestimate. Sorry, Harald, to jump in here, but I would just say what I was going to say before. We've talked about this for the herps of Madagascar, the future of the field guides there, and in the vast majority of cases, you don't have signal. You don't have electricity.
Okay. Yeah.
The utility of a book like that is as good as the infrastructure.
Yeah.
With that point made, what do you think? What's going to be more useful, a book in the hand or a digital book?
It's such a tricky one because we've got really good apps. So we've got Johan Murray's Snakes of, it's the African Snakebite Institute app, which has all the different species. So if you want to have a look, it's really useful. And it's the same. We've got the Frogs of Southern Africa app, which is absolutely amazing. And, I've got the book and I've got the app, but I mostly use the app because it's also got the calls.
Yeah,
and it's also something that's obviously updated.
At this point, also, let me just mention Frog ID from Australia, which like blows all of the frog books out of the water.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think I should mention the fact that it's because we've got really good resources put into creating something like that.
Yeah.
I think not many places around the world might have the same resources available.
Yeah.
I think where I wanted to go from here was a dive into the other style. So there are basically two styles of field guides where the word field guide gets very wishy-washy. There are photographic guides and field guides, but then there's also field guide versus handbook, right? A field guide, by definition, should be, well, then there's also a pocket guide, right? But, one of my favorite field guides, and not just because it's just the right size for cutting labels, is this book by Peter Heyman, Birdwatcher's Pocket Guide to the Birds of the UK and Europe. It's a fantastic pocket guide that genuinely fits in your pocket and is beautifully illustrated. It's also illustrated so that you can do that thing that's so important for bird people, which is to look at a bird and just by its shape be like, it's that one. That's the one it is. Which we can also do as herpetologists, but it's not necessarily so accessible. Anyway, so that's at one end of the scale. The other end of the scale are these things called that we often call handbooks, right? And I would say the Chameleons of Africa is decidedly a handbook. By handbook, we mean it takes more than one hand to hold it, and usually they're like major reference works. So this one by Tilbury has these totally luxurious, gigantic double-page spreads that make it fundamentally useless as a field guide.
Yeah.
Very pretty as a coffee table book and very pretty as a reference book. It is also extremely detailed information, but I would say that
you're not taking that
to have his cake both ways, right?
I was going to say, you're not taking that into Madagascar with you.
Well, no, it's only for mainland Africa anyway.
But
okay. Also it's just it's trying to do two different things at the same time, because he realized that there's a market for a book like that. It's good for me at the museum because I can actually use it. It has keys and stuff. And at the same time, there's a huge market of people who like chameleons, and this has gorgeous chameleon photos, and it's sold to them too at a very high price. I don't remember what I bought it for, but it was over 80 euros. So this is a very expensive reference book. In the same line, let me just, Gabriel, you wanted to talk about this one, which I would say is also decidedly a handbook. This is Savages, the Amphibians and Reptiles of Costa Rica, a herpetofauna between two continents, between two seas.
Yes.
Tell us
and
about it.
It's definitely very much a reference book. It has a huge, it has great information about anatomy and ecology of each species, which, if you're like me, that's very important. And also even to the length of the descriptions of the family and genera of like certain particular anatomic characteristics and taxonomic characteristics, which are like, very important if you're like me, if you're interested in that. And also has a very good section on ecology and the importance of the habitats in Costa Rica. So for me, that was one of the works that are influential that I wanted to emulate when I was working on my, and I wanted to say that field guides for me are like my first love. Everything I do as an illustrator and as a taxonomist has been influenced by field guides or handbooks. Those two things are very, very important for me. So they hold a special place in my heart for everything I do. And that book, in particular, Savage's book, for me has been very influential, both as a taxonomist and as an illustrator and, a designer.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these examples, and don't by any means interpret this to be a reference to be like, oh, this is the one that you have to have. All I want to do here is to highlight that there is this style of book that occupies its own space in the literature that is so important.
I didn't put it together until now, but you mentioned Chimera and Farbach, and I have the genus Triturus, which is it's exactly like the other one that you showed.
They're big handbook style. Style books. For a second there, I was holding up this contrast because there's a difference between the field guide and the handbook, right? The Savage handbook is, I would say, this probably weighs about 3 kilos, maybe a bit more.
Yeah, and that's a soft.
And this is the soft cover version.
The soft cover. I have the hardcover, and it's
insane. It's funny because a field guide should be a light and transportable thing. It should have the information easily accessible.
They're both reference books, but it's like you're
different style of reference. Where are you sitting? Yeah. Are you in the forest catching the animal, or are you back at base camp, or are you in your lab? Or whatever?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think you wanted to also show a book here that is kind of in that similar genre, right?
Well, this one's a book called Venomous Snakes of the World by Marco Shea, which I think is kind of really informative if you're looking for a generic understanding about snakes different parts of the world, what these different snake species are. So, I mean, coming back to what you were saying earlier, Ethan, I think it's, for a basic understanding on snakes, or if that's something you want to do, it's a good thing to have, but I wouldn't be taking that out with me when I'm in the field.
No, right.
Mark O'Shea is a famous field herpetologist who would, probably not take that book with him either. But
definitely not.
Yeah.
So let's go into the other categories of books that I have here, just because I want to mention a few of them. And basically, we only have 3 left, and we also don't have too much time left. So let's just dive right in. You mentioned before up-to-date taxonomy. And you mentioned, Gabriel, I believe you mentioned Amphibian Species of the World. Now, of course, back in 1985, Amphibian Species of the World was not a database online yet. It was published as a physical book. A big achievement at the time, but it's amazing how much it's changed how we refer to literature and everything since 1985. So, I have here a copy of that book, but I don't think anybody is ever going to look inside anymore because, first of all, there's a PDF available free online, and secondly, it's dramatically, of course, out of date.
Well, it's sort of it's a historical document at this point.
Document, definitely.
Yeah.
I would also just mention, if you're interested in anatomical features, basically any aspect of anatomical features of reptiles, there is a series of books by Carl Ganz et al., but mostly edited by Carl Ganz. They're called the Ganz series of books, published by AP Press. And I believe there are 23 volumes. I'm only showing here volume 1 and 21 because I don't think I have 22 and 23. But these 2 books, as representative of that series, contain unbelievably detailed comparative information on anatomy, on basically anything you want to know about anatomy, but also physiology, all kinds of other things. So incredible resources. Is it worth buying them? No, it is not. Why? Because you can go to, if you go Google Carl Ganz books, Ganz spelled Gans, you can get access to all of them online for free. You don't need to have them. And if you're up on your Python coding skills, you can also have a script scrape the website and download the PDFs. So that is another thing that you can do.
Python for your Pythons.
The Python for your Python. Then I just wanted to talk about, because a lot of what we talk about here on the show is a lot of evolutionary biology. And I wanted to talk about 3 final books here that are useful general background reading for evolutionary biology, systematics, and the way that we can apply those things in the field of herpetology. So the first one is The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. You might have heard of it. Fairly influential book. There is some more recent stuff that you should really read in order to kind of fully comprehend the implications of the book. But it's a good background for a lot of the stuff.
I hear he ripped that off of Wallace.
Then there's another very influential book by Ernst Mayr, which in its full title is called Systematics and the Origin of Species from the Viewpoint of a Zoologist. This book is famous because this is where this thing came from that's called the biological species concept. It was established in this book, and Mayr does some very interesting argumentation about basically how species are formed. And then finally, because those things that's historical, this is also an older book. I think this is from the 50s, 1942. And then finally, I just want to mention a book that, while it's not a good, it's not going to give you a basic foundational understanding of evolutionary biology or whatever, is a really beautiful demonstration of what all you can do with a single evolutionary system. And this is this book called Lizards in an Evolutionary Tree, Ecology and Adaptive Radiation of Anoles by Jonathan Lossos. This book is basically the culmination of a very, very long period. I don't know how long. Sorry, Jonathan, you're not that old, but still a long period of work. And obviously a lot of work has gone into it, summarizing the incredible body of research that was built up around the discoveries and just concentrated, systematically structured work that was done on anoles, and what that has taught us about evolutionary biology in general.
Which is so much because anoles and all these
so
are
much. They're a really awesome model system for a lot of good reasons, written in a conversational style. If you're interested,
I very much highly recommend
biology,
that book.
It's a good book, and I think that it's a good place for you to start. Lossos has other books as well that you may also enjoy. But I think if you're interested in lizards and understanding how the study of herpetology or how a herpetological aspect can be brought into studying things in evolutionary biology, this is a very, very good place to start. And I think that kind of brings us to the end of, there's actually one more book that's sitting on my desk, but it's underneath some heavy ones, so I can't get to it right now. So we don't have to go into it, but I think that kind of wraps up. I just wanted to say, basically, I have a whole library of herpetological literature that's available to me because I am a curator and I sit in a museum. A lot of these things will be available at a local library, be it, or maybe not a local one, but a state library that you can access if you're in the States, or a national library that you can access if you're outside of the US. So you may be able to access some of this literature even if you can't buy it. You can buy much of the literature we've just talked about. Most of these things are still on the market. And for instance, NHBS, if you're based in Europe, is a good place to get them from. I'm sure that there are equivalent stores in the US for buying books like that. So, get hold of whatever literature is on a topic that interests you. I think, the question was basically, where do I start if I'm interested in reptiles? You can start anywhere. You can start at the basic level. You can start in detail. Finally, if we have time for it, Ethan, do you want to briefly mention some captive care books?
So I mentioned the Peterson Field Guide. I also am going to plug my own book.
Moistly Harmless, excellent reading.
Moistly Harmless and How to Appreciate Newts and Salamanders. And it's a short read. It's a comic book. It's part memoir, part care guide, part, a little bit field guide, actually. There's a couple of
illustrations of mine there, too.
Yeah. Forward by our friend Darren Naish. So I did one. That's a book. I recommend it. I don't have a copy of this with me, but I was going to also recommend Rhacodactylus, The Complete Guide to Their Selection and Care, which is by Philippe Davis-Jolly, Alan Rapace, and Frank Fast, which is an amazing book. Talk about being 20 years out of date. Like it's got a crested gecko on the cover. They're not even considered in the genus Rhacodactylus anymore. It's an amazing book from the standpoint of we thought that species was extinct. Turned out we were looking on the wrong island for them. And this is about the guys who found it. And, it's got some amazing pictures from them. They were the first guys to bring them back into captivity. And now they're everywhere. So.
Oh, no. I just realized there's an entire genre of book that we've missed, which is popular herpetology books. Tracks and Shadows by Harry Green, for instance, comes to mind. I can't.
But we'll have to do a part 2, maybe.
Yeah. Improbable Destinies, by the way, is the other book by Jonathan Lossos. Good reading if you're interested. If you're coming from an outsider perspective into evolutionary biology.
Well, also we should probably mention Anole Annals.
Annals, yeah.
Yeah.
Or Anole Annals.
Anole Annals.
Thank you.
Well, let's not bring that whole debate back. And then so that's a great book as far as care goes, because it's from their rediscovery to bringing them into captivity. It's also very hard to find now. I looked it up. It's $300. So, but it's a great book. The other one I want to recommend is this.
I grew up with that one.
I grew up with this one as well.
What's it called?
It's called The Complete Illustrated Atlas of Reptiles and Amphibians for the Terrarium.
I remember each and every photo in that book.
It is it's an amazing book. I remember saving up and spending my own money to buy this when I was a kid.
Same.
And it is just an incredible. It's 30 years out of date as far as the species names and stuff, but it has entries for every animal that's ever been in the hobby.
It almost lists every genus.
Yeah.
of every amphibian and reptiles ever. It's like a dictionary.
This is a formative work for me, and I love this book. And actually, the photos are fantastic in it too.
And he has some line drawings too.
Yeah. It's got some art. It's got some and the information in it, as far as the care goes, is pretty accurate.
I would say that was a formative book for me too, because I grew up with that book as well.
So I wanted to recommend that one. You can still get it. It's probably wildly out of print, but you can still find copies of it, and it's great.
And probably expensive as hell because it's huge.
I think this one, it wasn't too bad. I think it was like $100.
Oh. Many of these, especially the ones that were printed like that in huge copy numbers, are not as expensive as you might expect. There is also one final genre to mention, which is children's books. If you haven't yet got a copy of Joan Proctor Dragon Doctor, you should get a copy of Joan Proctor Dragon Doctor. What a fantastic book. Really, really, really good. There are many other children's books, but that's the most impressive one. Anybody have any more final books that they want to talk about? No?
We could probably sit here and talk about books forever.
We can do it forever and ever. I think, so tomorrow, to answer your question, get started wherever you feel like. Pick up, you can go deep, you can go shallow, you can go broad, you can go narrow. And basically everything is kind of feeding into your brain, which is going to collate that information and make you insufferable at parties, which is kind of half of the point.
Or not. You could be like me and just read the same book over and over again because, it's comforting.
Yeah, I do that as well. Fantastic. Well, thank you all for listening to this rather different episode of the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed this more direct and flowing style. Hey, Hiral, where can one find you on the internet?
I'm at Hiral Naik on most platforms, but at Hiral's Hive on Instagram.
Excellent. And how about you, Ethan?
So I am consolidating everything into one site. That's what I've been working on most of the week. And you can now see all my stuff at mossy_log.blog.
mossy_log.blog. Excellent. Yep. Gabriel, how about you?
I am at Serpent Illus on everywhere. Blue Sky, on Instagram, still on Twitter, and on my website at gabrielugueto.com.
Fantastic. You can find me, well, right now you can't find me on the internet because I'm hiding from it, but in general, in a better week than this one, you can find me at Mark Scherz, MarkScherz, all over the internet. And if you don't find me there, you can also Google and find me that way. You can find the podcast at SquaMatesPod all over the internet as well. YouTube.com/@SquaMatesPod if you want to watch our beautiful faces while we make the show for you. We appreciate that. We love your comments and your questions. And Gabriel is taking a mid-roll picture here. You can send us emails. We love it when you send us emails and direct feedback that way. Or of course, you can leave us a review on iTunes. Our email address is squamatespod@gmail.com. And of course, show notes, often quite extensive, found at squamatespod.com. Thank you so much for listening. And
send us more questions. We enjoy doing this kind of episode. So
we do. Yeah. It's fun. We don't get enough input, so we're very happy to hear what you want to hear about, and hopefully offer you some useful advice. And finally, as we say on the show,
Hakuna Matata.